The cliffs on the island of Saipan were once shaped by nothing but wind and ocean waves. But in July of 1944, this place witnessed one of the most haunting scenes of World War II.
Land the landing craft! Go, go, go!
As American forces advanced, they saw Japanese families, including children and the elderly, quietly walking to the edge of the cliffs, holding each other tightly, and then jumping into the sea. This was not a moment of sudden impulse.
Yes, it feels right. Let us decide together.
For many civilians, it was what they believed they had to do. For years, they had been taught that Americans were demons and that surrender was worse than death. Propaganda portrayed Americans with claws and fangs, spreading fear that capture meant torture and execution. A 5-year-old boy named Kushiroma still remembers his father's desperate words saying that the Americans would kill him. He was told that he had to die by his own hand. The boy jumped with the crowd, but survived when his clothing caught on a tree branch. His story reflects a much larger tragedy, the tragedy of fear that was carefully and systematically cultivated. Saipan was not the only case. Similar scenes unfolded on Tinian and later, on an even more horrific scale, on Okinawa. What all of these tragedies shared was a collective fear built up over years of war and propaganda. But were the Japanese always afraid of Americans? The answer is no, not always. Before the war, many Japanese people even looked down on the United States. Relations between the two countries worsened when the United States imposed economic sanctions to protest Japan's expansion of the war in Asia. In particular, cutting off the oil supply was seen as a humiliation and a direct threat. Japanese propaganda described Americans as morally decayed, overly individualistic, undisciplined, and lacking the warrior spirit. Despite their wealth and advanced technology, they were portrayed as strong in material terms but weak in spirit. Japan believed that collective discipline and a willingness to sacrifice would defeat a nation drowning in material excess. When the war began, this belief did not change much at first. Japanese soldiers noted that American troops had powerful firepower, accurate shooting, and strong support. But they still believed the enemy relied too heavily on artillery, lacked initiative, and was spoiled by an abundant logistics system. However, by the end of 1943, reality began to overturn those assumptions. Despite suffering heavy losses, American forces kept pushing forward. Ships that were sunk were quickly replaced. Aircraft that were lost were replaced in even greater numbers. Meanwhile, Japanese forces grew increasingly short on manpower and equipment and were forced to send very young soldiers into battle. What truly frightened Japanese soldiers was not the individual American soldier, but the war machine behind them, a massive industrial system far away, yet seemingly endless. Many wrote in their diaries that fighting the United States was like fighting the tide, impossible to stop. At the same time, the image of the American Marine became a symbol of brutality. Japanese propaganda amplified this image, portraying them as savage and inhuman. Horrifying rumors spread, convincing both soldiers and civilians that surrender meant death. It was this fear that led to the mass suicides on Saipan. Even though American soldiers tried to reassure civilians and used interpreters, many still believed death was the only option. When fear runs that deep, reason no longer has a place. The longer the war dragged on, the more that fear was reinforced. Fake surrenders, brutal close combat, and the overwhelming artillery firepower of American forces made the enemy seem increasingly terrifying in Japanese eyes. For those who believed spirit mattered more than machines, that crushing industrial power had a devastating psychological impact. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a cycle of violence and fear. Propaganda convinced the Japanese that Americans were monsters. Actions on the battlefield only strengthened that belief. Neither side could see the other as ordinary human beings anymore. Okinawa marked the peak of this tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Many were forced into labor or pressured to believe that suicide was the only way to preserve their honor. The casualty figures led the United States to believe that invading the Japanese home islands would cost millions of lives.
Thank you.
Ironically, when the war ended and American forces occupied Japan, many civilians were surprised to find that they did not encounter the demons they had been taught to expect. The discipline and restraint of the occupation forces exposed just how distorted wartime propaganda had been. So, were the Japanese afraid of Americans? Yes, but that fear did not exist from the beginning. It formed gradually, shifting from contempt to respect, and finally to terror when defeat became unavoidable. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss more history videos. Thank you all so much for the support you have shown to the channel.